All right, everyone. Let's get started. So for the first 10-15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a bit about the paper. So I've been getting a number of questions about the paper, which is good that you're starting to think about it. So a reminder that the paper draft is due the first Monday after reading week. So you will both upload it to eClass and send it to your peer review partner. And if you don't have one, or if you do have one, double check that they're still in the course. If you don't have one, get one. If you don't receive an email from someone with the paper, let me know and we'll work something out. I'll probably just get some other random student to send it to you as well, because part of your mark, so there's three components to this. There's the paper draft, which is 5%. There's the peer review, which is due, I think, a week later, and that's also 5%. Those first two things, I will be very nice about mark. Well, I shouldn't say very, but as long as you make a good faith attempt, you know, if I read it and it basically makes sense, that's good enough. I'll be meaner with the actual final submission. So the final submission is worth 25%, and 5 of those percent are APA style. So paper draft goes here, peer review goes here, final obviously there. So that's the general lay of the land. Please follow the instructions on the syllabus. So no sense in losing marks for formatting. Read this before you upload it. So as far as the difficult part, actually, you know, coming up with an idea and writing about it. So the basic structure is you have to have 4 sources. 2 of them will be your main studies that you devote a section to each. So there's the introduction, study 1, study 2, and your research proposal. The 2 papers that are study 1 and study 2 have to have a methods and results section. They cannot be review articles, philosophy articles, or books. You can use things like that as your other 2 sources, maybe in the intro or in discussing the motivation for your research proposal. Yes?
Are replication studies okay?
Yes. That's the structure. The most difficult section will be the research proposal section. There's different ways you could go here. So one thing I've said in passing, both early on in the course and personally to some of you, is that a good idea is to find a debate and come up with an idea that, of a study that would help settle the debate, but you don't have to do that. Another thing you could do is find 2 papers that agree mostly, and maybe spot some limitations, and that can lead you to an idea for a research proposal. That's fine too. You don't have to make a prediction about which way the study will go. You can if it's well motivated. If you see a particular pattern and think, okay, I see evidence it's going to go this way, you can. But you could also just say, okay, you know, team A says this, team B says this, here's the study. If team A is right, this should happen. If team B is right, this should happen. That's also acceptable. Part of the reason we're having the paper after Unit 3 is in Unit 3, you will see my thought process for how I did this, for the paper that I got published. One way of looking at my paper is it's a contribution to the debate between Green and Kahan. So we'll be looking at kind of the logic of that debate, what the kinds of evidence that each side appeals to, and how my paper was a contribution to that debate. In addition to that, you can also, if you want to look at something that's more similar to what you all will be doing, you can look at the example paper. It's on a totally different topic from Unit 3. It's on kind of the empathy topic that we looked at Unit 1. I wrote this paper for a course in graduate school. It's not my absolute best work, but it's similar to what you all will be doing. The one limit kind of rule about what you can write about, you don't use the sources in that paper. The temptation to plagiarize, even accidentally, is going to be too great. In fact, I'd recommend not even writing on that same topic. Other than that, you can write on any topic in moral psychology. Yes?
In your example paper, some of it's written sort of in first person. Is that appropriate?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm okay with first person, especially in the research proposal.
Okay.
You know, I propose that we do this study. That's fine. You don't have to be like, you know, John doesn't like referring to John in the third person. You know, whatever. You can write in the first person. That's fine. So as I was saying, you can write on any topic in moral psychology. You do not have to write on something that we cover in the course. You can use papers that are listed there, but you don't have to. I would recommend the best way to be successful is pick something you care about. Pick something you're interested in. Right? Might as well write about something that's fun to write about. One other thing I'll mention that could be helpful is a little trick to use on Google Scholar. And by the way, Google Scholar gets some hate from pretentious professors. Google Scholar is great. The only limitation is sometimes there are papers that aren't available there. Okay, fine, copy it into the U of A library and then find it, you know, there to get the PDF. But as far as finding articles, it's very good. So let's say you want to write about empathy. Well, that's similar to my other one, but just suppose. So you look through, let's say, this is an emotion review, that's a psych journal. I don't know if it has, let's see if it has a methods and results section. Looks like it's a review article, which is fine if it's not one of the main ones, but one thing you can do is look at this, cited by. So if you don't know how to use this, very useful. You click cited by. This is everyone who cited that paper. And then you can also click this, search within citing articles. Let's say I want to see if someone defends compassion as an alternative or whatever. Then I can find all the papers that cite that previous paper that mentioned compassion. So if you want to find a response to one of your papers, this is a good strategy to use. Okay, any questions about the paper? Not that I thought there'd be more. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. So if you haven't gotten started, I would recommend doing so. I'm sure some of you will just cram during reading week, which isn't the end of the world, it's a draft, but at least be thinking about what topic you want to write about. Okay. So as a prelude to, so today we're going to be continuing our discussion of objections to Green's dual process model, and the main paper is the first one, which is the Kahan paper. But I'm going to build up to that, first of all, with a discussion question. Forget about hypothetical dilemmas in a philosophy class. Imagine you were actually, you know, beside a train or trolley, and you watched someone push another human in front of the trolley to save 5 others. What do you think of that person? Do you want to be friends with that person? What judgment would you make about their character or their psychology? So break off into small groups and discuss. Okay, some groups have gone quiet. I'll take that as the cue. Okay, so what did we come up with? What are some different thoughts that people had? Yeah.
I think for someone to be able to do that in the moment, the like chance that they're a psychopath like goes up so high that unless they have like a meltdown afterwards, I'm not going to be convinced that this person's not a psychopath, and therefore I would not want to associate.
I hadn't thought, that's an interesting point you had at the end, that like, you may be somewhat comforted if they feel like, no, like this totally broke me, but I felt like I had to do it. That would, but if they're just like, well, what are you talking about? The math says, you know, then maybe that'd be a little concerning. Okay, yeah.
You're talking about something similar where it's how long it takes them to come to that decision. Like if they just like see it happen, they're just like pushing them immediately.
Yeah,
Like, maybe I don't want to be around this person that much. But if they're like spending a lot of time, they're obviously super conflicted. If they do end up doing it, I wouldn't see it as like as poorly as I still probably wouldn't want to be, you know, near them, near a train track with them, but
Yeah, that's right.
it still would be a bit better.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the main thing we had talked about is the idea of like the lack of trust that would kind of be there with myself and that person.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know how I would feel about
You don't want to be
later
the next
decisions.
trolley stopper.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like later decisions that they would make, and then any involving me, how would that go?
Yeah.
Well, you could trust him as long as you were skinny.
Right. I wasn't commenting
Sorry.
on it, but yeah. I hadn't thought of that, that's right. Okay, any other thoughts? Although, you might have a big backpack, don't forget about that.
That's certainly don't wear a backpack. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, hey, it's, yeah, what were you wearing when he pushed you? No. I didn't say that, I'll edit that part out. Okay, go ahead.
You just said that, like, yeah, it would be an emotional response, like, we wouldn't like that person, but then I go, well, could they, like, social intuitionists wanna, like, reason you to change your thoughts on them? If they're like, oh, but it was for the good of the people, it's the majority?
Right, so you're kind of thinking like, yeah, that may be my gut reaction, but maybe I should reflect on it more carefully and not just confabulate reasons why. Yep, interesting point, yep.
We were talking about perspective being a big factor too, because if you were just a random person watching it happen, I don't think either way I'd want to be associated with the guy that got pushed
Yeah.
over. But the
Or you mean the guy who
situation-
pushed?
Sorry?
You mean the guy who pushed?
Yeah, the guy that pushed,
Yeah.
sorry.
The guy who got pushed over is
pushed over is gonna be hard to
Yeah,
associate.
exactly, yeah. Sorry, go
If
ahead.
like you were hypothetically one of the 5 people that was strapped down and you saw that happen
Right.
too, then it's kind of like, well, do you want to be friends with him because he saved your life, or is it because you actually like him? And it's like that kind of switches up the scenario too.
Good, yeah, so all very good points, so lots to think about here. But I think generally, people's initial intuition is, I'm definitely skeptical of this person. You know, A, I don't want to be the next person he uses for the greater good, but also, particularly if he does it quickly, seems like he might be kind of psychopathic. Like, we don't want to be around people who can harm people super easily. This is related to the point that Kahan makes. As I said at the end of the last class, his basic point is these types of dilemmas, these personal sacrificial dilemmas where you have to harm someone to save many, are not really tracking commitment to utilitarian principles, but a lack of caring about hurting people. There was a paper a few years before Kahan that made this point first, but just with a smaller number of variables and smaller number of studies, done by David Pizarro, who we saw back in Unit 2. And to, again, help lead into Kahan's paper, I have a clip from the Very Bad Wizards podcast, which I strongly recommend, especially the earlier episodes. I feel like they're running out of ideas, but they talk a lot about moral psychology and related topics, and so it's also just very funny. And so here, David Pizarro and the philosopher on the podcast, Tamler Summers, talk about the study that was the precursor to the Kahan paper. As a note, to understand some of the offhanded jokes they make, he was visiting Canada at the time. They're both Americans, but he was visiting Canada. So that's a pretty accurate depiction of what that podcast is like. So probably attracted some of you and repelled others, but if you want to watch more, it's could be even useful for thinking of a paper topic. For those of you who aren't here today, who are watching this video, so Pizarro talks about an experience he had working in a maximum security prison, teaching about psychology. And he taught, the trolley problem and some of the psychology related to that. And he tried to get them to have the intuition that most people have, that it seems okay to pull the switch to redirect the trolley to kill one, to save many, but not okay to push someone in front of the trolley. And there was one particularly menacing or psychopathic looking guy in the front who was like, "What do you mean? It's the same fucking thing." And then he used it as a teaching tool. So as you can see, psychopathy is associated with, more utilitarian responses to the personal sacrificial dilemmas. Yes.
Sorry, before the podcast, you said, like, the point of Khan is that it's not about commitment to utilitarianism. It's
Yes.
about the willingness to harm others, which is what
Pizarro makes a very similar point. So Pizarro published a paper, I think 4 years earlier, arguing something similar, but just a shorter paper, less going on. I could have included it, but as I've already said, I think there's enough in this unit. But now we'll actually get into the Kahan paper. So yes, so the argument that Kahan makes is that utilitarian, it's important that he puts utilitarian in quotation marks at the beginning of the paper, like in the title. People in the Kahan camp prefer the term pro-sacrificial, just meaning they endorse sacrificing someone to save many, because they don't want to presuppose that shoving someone involves a commitment to utilitarian values. So they think it's better to use the neutral term pro-sacrificial. But in the title, you want it to be clickbaity, so there they say, quote, utilitarian judgments. So they did several correlational studies. I'm not going to go through everything, but in the key terms, have highlighted some of the main findings. So utilitarian answers or pro-sacrificial answers to these dilemmas are positively correlated with business ethics violations. So you give them a kind of business dilemma where you could cheat to get something. People are more likely to say that's okay if they said, yeah, push the man in front of the trolley. In a replication of Pizarro's study, they are higher in psychopathy. You give them a psychopathy scale, they're higher on it. They are also higher on rational egoism, so they're more likely to endorse the statement that it is rational to always do what's in your self-interest. And if these are measuring utilitarianism, that's a pretty strange result, right? Because utilitarianism, if it's full-blown, would involve a commitment to self-sacrifice, right? You'll be more willing to sacrifice yourself if it's in the service of the greater good. Some of the most important utilitarian philosopher today, Peter Singer, a good deal of his work has been devoted to arguing that we should do more things like giving to charity and so on. So the fact that answers to the trolley-like dilemmas are correlated positively with egoism, that's a little strange if we think of these as good measures of utilitarian tendencies. There was no significant correlation between utilitarian answers to these dilemmas and identification with humanity as a whole, with charitable donations, or with utilitarian answers to what Kahan calls greater good dilemmas. So these are dilemmas that involve self-sacrifice and or impartiality. So I think around half of them involve self-sacrifice, so sacrificing yourself for the greater good, and some of them involve if you could help your mother a little bit, or you could help a stranger in the hospital a lot, is it morally better to help the stranger in the hospital? A utilitarian should say yes, if the benefit is greater, and again, in that case, no correlation between giving utilitarian answers to things like that and utilitarian, quote, utilitarian answers to trolley-like dilemmas. Now, so there's different resources Green has here. One that I'll just mention in passing before we keep going towards the, I think, more sophisticated response. One thing Green can say is, and has said, is the trolley-like dilemmas are not meant to measure explicit commitment to utilitarianism. In Green's work, he says that quite straightforwardly. And what he intends them to be is a way of distinguishing different psychological processes. It's not saying that people who say yes, push the large man are full-blown utilitarians. Having said that, I think that Kahan's paper still presents a serious problem, and we'll move towards, as I say, a more sophisticated response. But before that, one more paper from Kahan and the Kahan team. So Kahan et al. Don't say, well, therefore we should just give up on measuring utilitarian commitments. They put forward an alternative way of doing it that relied on factor analysis. So this is a review from Intro Psych, but factor analysis in psychology is used to look at which test items or questionnaire items tend to cluster together. So, if I gave all of you the following 3 questions, how happy are you? How often do you wake up really excited to start the day? How often do you smile? Those 3 questions would all be positively correlated. And we could probably extract a factor that would explain a lot of the variance in people's responses to those questions. As I'm sure many of you remember, in the case of IQ, like mental tests, all mental tests are positively correlated, so there's, at least to a first approximation, one factor that you can extract. Bonus marks if someone can tell me what the name is. What's the first major dimension of mental tests? The main one that explains why people do well in the other tests. No one remembers from 105? The G factor, general intelligence. For intelligence, it works out to roughly that. For personality, and this is obviously an oversimplification, but to a first approximation, there are 5 factors. That's kind of the consensus now, is that items on personality tests tend to cluster into 5 clumps. We'll actually be talking about the big 5 in the chapter on virtue. So Kahan et al. Did this with moral questions. So they gave people various questions that relate to utilitarian judgment, not just with harming other people, but a whole bunch of different types of ethical questions. And then tried to extract the factors that explained most of the variance. And they extracted 4. And 2 of them they turned into a questionnaire. So I'll go through the 4 first, and then focus a little more on the first 2. So the first one they call the impartial beneficence scale, or factor. Most of the items here have to do with self-sacrifice, 4 out of 5, 4 of the 5 that they take out to be part of their scale. But the spin they put on it is, this is about caring for people impartially. You want to make people better off, even if you have to sacrifice your own interests to make that happen. The second factor, which is more similar to the stuff that Green measures, is the instrumental harm scale. So this is a willingness to use harm or violence to increase the greater good. The next one is anti-traditional morality. So some features of traditional morality, like various sexual norms, norms having to do with punishment, a utilitarian should not endorse, because all that matters is preventing suffering and increasing happiness. So giving utilitarian answers to those kinds of questions tend to also go together. And then the final one is truth-telling and promise-keeping. So this is a willingness to lie or break promises if it increases happiness. So you're willing to, lie to make someone feel better or save someone's life or what have you. If grandma asks if you like the sweater she got you, you say yes, even if you don't. So, as I say, they took the first 2 of these factors, the impartial beneficence scale and the instrumental harm scale, and put them together to form the Oxford Utilitarianism scale. I'll just bring it up, actually. So if you're curious, there used to be a nice online version that you could press responses and get a score. But if you're curious, you can just use the article. Let's bring it up. Yes, so The first 5 here are the impartial beneficence scales. This is page 145. You can do this when you get home. Each one's on a scale of 1 to 7, if I remember correctly. So these are primarily about self-sacrifice, the impartial beneficence scale, and then instrumental harm is primarily about a willingness to harm others to maximize the greater good. So then you get a total score on each. And the paper concludes with different lines of evidence for the construct validity of these different measures. So construct validity is important in contemporary psychology. There's some controversy about it. I had a professor who thought this term was too theoretical and we should focus on types of validity that are more well defined. But the idea is we have a test, scale, IQ test, whatever, and then we have a theoretical construct. And what we want is for the test to measure this. So in the case of IQ, we have some definition of intelligence, some theory of what intelligence is. That would be the theoretical construct. So maybe your theory is, intelligence is a person's ability to solve cognitively difficult problems or something like that. Or you could say it's about the brain's processing speed, whatever your theory is. And then the question is, does the test measure that? Does it measure that theoretical construct? But there is no definitive way of proving that a test has construct validity. You can only provide indirect pieces of evidence for it. In the case of the Kahan paper, they did this with a series of correlations, finding that it's the correlations take the pattern that you would expect. So, for example, the instrumental harm subscale correlates with psychopathy, similar to prior work finding that willingness to harm others to maximize the greater good is correlated with psychopathy, whereas the impartial beneficence scale is correlated with things like hypothetical donation, so willingness to give money to charity. So there's other correlations they mentioned. There's another one, I forget where it is, but you don't have to know the details there, but these correlations provide, as I say, indirect evidence of construct validity, at least if we assume the standard theoretical assumptions in psychology. Yes?
So if I understand this correctly, the arguments from Kahan about this don't really disprove the dual process model in any way. It's more a separate criticism about what conclusions you should draw from it.
Yeah, there's different ways of thinking about it. So, yeah, in other work, Kahan has criticized the dual process model, but I think the papers that we've looked at are a criticism of their operationalization of utilitarian judgment, so how they operationally define it. These measures, the trolley-like dilemmas, they argue, aren't really measuring commitment to utilitarianism, they're measuring a lack of harm aversion, a lack of caring about hurting people. So, now there are different responses, one of which we'll look at next, but I think that's the right way to think about these particular papers. They think that, so in the case of utilitarian judgment, they think that their Oxford utilitarianism scale is a better way of measuring utilitarian judgment. Oh, yeah, follow up, yeah.
So they're saying it's a better way to measure utilitarian judgment, but Green wasn't trying to measure if people are utilitarians or not.
Yes.
They're trying to uncover the mechanisms. That's why I don't see how that criticizes the model.
Yeah, good. So that's one response that Green would make. I mean, I may be biased. I'm more on Green's side in these debates, but so I'm not sure what Colin would say to that counter, objection. But I think that is a good objection. Okay, so I've been alluding to a more sophisticated response that the green team made, specifically Paul Conway's. There's two papers where Conway's the first author. We likely won't finish them, but I'll at least get us started. The second of those papers has Green as a co-author. Here, sorry, I'll bring up the pictures. So Conway used a method called process dissociation to separate out a lack of harm aversion. So Kahan alleges that what's really going on with these pro-sacrificial or utilitarian responses is people just don't care about harming people. So Conway used an existing technique, process dissociation, and applied it to people's responses to these kinds of dilemmas. And the technique involves giving people two sets of 10 parallel dilemmas. In one case, the harm maximizes the greater good. And in the other case, it does not. The harm does not maximize the greater good. It'll be the same type of harm, but it will not lead to better consequences overall. Here's a simple case, so you can read the paper in the appendix. It has a full list. My paper used the same 20, so I think it's in my appendix too. But here's one example. Let's say you have to torture someone to find lethal bombs. A utilitarian, at least ceteris paribus, is going to say yes. In that case, you should torture, because you'll save lives. You can imagine rule utilitarian objections to that, but again, as a first approximation, probably utilitarian is going to say yes, you should torture someone to find bombs. In the parallel case, and the dilemmas are all given in a fixed random order, so they're never like, and they make sure that it's never one right after the other. It's torture to find paint bombs. So there are paint bombs in the city. They're going to be a real nuisance for the city to clean up. Can we torture someone to find where the paint bombs are? And presumably in that case, a utilitarian would not endorse that. Right? The amount of suffering caused by torture is greater than the suffering prevented by finding the paint bombs. So 10 of each, parallel in each case, and then what you can do is subtract this from this. Technically the equation works differently, but it's equivalent to subtracting this from this. So to the extent that people endorse torture in these cases, they have a lower utilitarian score. Unfortunately, there's different terms for this. In some parts of the paper, they call it the U parameter, or utilitarian parameter. In the tables, they call it the PD, process dissociation measure of utilitarianism. But that's what it is. It's how likely they are to endorse harm in this case, and then you subtract how likely they are to endorse it in this case. So this is a very important concept to understand some of the work that follows. Does the basic logic make sense? Any follow-up questions? I see some looks of... So the short version is the U parameter or process dissociation measure gets at how likely people are to harm others only when it maximizes the greater good. You know, you can think of these as almost being like a psychopath measure, right? Yeah, sure, torture them just to find the paint bombs. And then through an equation that's harder to understand, they extract the D parameter, or also called the process dissociation measure of deontology. And take my word for it, I've worked through it. This one is equivalent to saying that harm is wrong in both cases. The more that you tend to say that harm is wrong either way, the higher your D parameter score will be. Yes?
Sorry, so the PD measure of utilitarianism is how likely to harm others if it increases the greater good?
Yes, exactly. Only when it increases the greater good. So if you want a perfect score, like a score of 1, you would say yes to all of the 10. So yes, I'll push someone in front of the trolley, I'll torture someone to find the bomb, I'll smother the baby to save the lives. But you say no to all of these. So I'm not going to torture someone just to find paint bombs. I think the baby one is you're not going to smother the baby to avoid being kidnapped and put in prison for overnight or something like that. Maybe longer, I forget. But in any case, so if you say no to all of those, then you'd have a perfect score of 1 on the U parameter. So in the 2013 paper, which I guess we'll just wrap up, they did some dual process type studies. So in one study they did cognitive load. So they gave people in one condition a complex thing to memorize. In the control condition they have a simple thing to memorize. And cognitive load decreased people's U parameter scores. So when they have to think about something complicated while they're reading the dilemmas, they are less likely to give utilitarian responses as measured by the U parameter. But it didn't affect their D parameter scores or deontology scores. In another manipulation, another study, they manipulated degree of empathic concern and found that increasing empathy increased people's D parameter or deontology scores, but did not affect their utilitarian parameter scores. Okay, any questions about the Conway 2013 paper? Yes?
Which one gets subtracted from which one again?
So the way to remember it, the actual equation is a little different, but what I'm going to say is equivalent to that, and it's the easier one to see what's going on. Subtract this from this. So in other words, the more you say, don't torture to find paint bombs, that'll make you more utilitarian. The perfect utilitarian would say 100% yes to this and 100% no to this. Okay, it's 11:50, we're out of time. If you have other questions, you come up and ask me. Next time we'll start with the Conway 2018.